Hi everyone, welcome back to UK USA, Colin Bristow's US UK Tax and Estate Planning podcast. I'm Aidan Grant again, and this is the third and final episode in our three-part mini-series looking at the consequences of the UK budget 2024 for Americans. I am once again joined by Emily Malvasso, a senior associate here in our tax and estate planning team. And Emily, we have basically covered off people thinking of moving to the UK and people in the UK, and now we're going to think about people leaving the UK. Of course, we hope that no one is leaving the UK. Everyone wants to stay here. Our weather is great. But let's just imagine, hypothetically, some people do decide to go to America. It does happen. These Brits who've left, or people that are trying to escape these new rules. And let me sort of ask you first more about that 10-year tail we've been talking about in the first couple of episodes, or what might be a 10-year tail. How does this kind of long-term residency status, this new LTR status, how do we lose it?
So it depends on how many years somebody has been UK tax resident for. So you look at the last 20 years, and if somebody has been tax resident for at least 10 of those, then they will have to remain outside of the UK for 3 years before they lose their, before that tail ends.
Yeah.
And after that, the years increase. So somebody who has been UK resident for either 10 or 30, up to 13 of the last 20 years, loses the tail after 3 years. And then after that, a year is added on until it takes up to 10 full years to lose your UK inheritance tax tail if you were previously in the UK for 20 tax years.
So it's kind of like 4 for 14, 5 for 15, 6 for 16, with a minimum of 3.
Exactly.
So that's the kind of the way.
Between 3 and 10 years.
Yeah. Which, at 3 years is actually pretty much the same as, in effect, what we already had, but now with clarity, which is great. Again, we're back to one of the consequences is clarity for people.
Yeah.
After 3 years, you are definitely outside the scope of this sort of taxation on your foreign assets. That's not inconsequential.
Yes, and we're not having to worry about calendar years versus tax years, depending on
have you lost your domicile status
or an actual domicile, so common law.
Let's not kill ourselves. We quite like a nice domicile assessment. This is going to be clear, which is great, but it doesn't mean that we can't sort of wangle on about, do you still vote in UK elections? Do you still keep your sort of, library card in the UK? But up to 10 years, and this is one of the things trailed before the budget, but since it's come out of the budget that has been, felt most emotively, the idea that the UK is going to still tax you on a worldwide basis to inheritance tax on for 10 years, that's a lot of years.
Yes, and especially for those people who left some time ago and thought that they were already outside of the scope of the UK IHT net, they've been outside of the UK for, say, 5 years. They're now counted back in, having previously been in the UK for, say, 20 years.
Yeah.
And that is, that has really sort of far-reaching consequences, and people will not be too happy about that.
Yeah, I'm sort of trying to imagine.
Clients won't be.
Someone who's retired to Florida or something, very British sounding, but Auntie Deirdre or something, Auntie Margaret has moved to Florida and has spent 10 years in Florida, maybe 9 years in Florida, and then passed away. Are the people in Florida going to know that, hey, you definitely need to go and check that she isn't taxed on a worldwide basis to inheritance tax, particularly given what we know about the difference in rates and thresholds between estate tax and inheritance tax? That is really quite consequential, because for someone that until now had been living outside the UK for 10 years and, let's say, died in the US, we would have said often with some degree of confidence that person probably has an argument that they're not a UK domiciliary. Now, 10 years, it's quite binary.
Yeah, exactly. And people who don't realise that there's been this extension to the inheritance tax tail, they'll likely be caught, when they're doing their own estate planning. So somebody who has moved to the US and say is in California and has their California real estate, hypothetically, and they will likely be advised to put everything into a living trust. And why wouldn't they? And suddenly we're looking at the UK inheritance tax implications of that at a time when normally we shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So it can, 20% entry charges and everything else.
And it's going to be a problem because that Californian is going to think, well, this client's got 10 years. And are you telling me that I can't put these assets into a living trust for 10 years because there might be an inheritance tax risk? Well, my client's going to have a Californian premium risk if we do that. And this is something we're going to have to grapple with. And I say I mean, literally you and me, because we're supposed to talk to these people and go, well, look, these are the consequences. Can we maybe have a will for the first couple of years? Can we maybe leave the assets outside the living trust and have it unfunded and have it, pour over after that period? Or, let's do the first round of estate planning that's simple, and then let's maybe think about the more sophisticated estate planning once you get certain you're outside of the inheritance tax regime. But yeah, whereas before I was jokingly pointing out to all the wealth managers and the accountants, now I'm speaking directly to any US attorneys that are thinking of this. If some bloke comes to your offices and speaks with a thick Brummie accent and says, I've just stepped off the plane from an airport in the UK, don't put their assets in a living trust unless you've spoken to Emily or me first, because we really, really don't want their clients to be subject to a 20% inheritance tax charge that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, and without forgetting that obviously we're talking about a 10-year tax sale in terms of UK tax years, somebody could technically be outside of the UK for 12 years, so it's
because they left kind of just before the end of 1 year and just after the end of another year, and it can be 12 years, right?
So it can be more than 10. So yeah, the advice is for those US attorneys is you're sure your clients have been out of the UK for at least 10 UK tax years.
Which is to not disregard the kind of wider advice we've always given to clients, and I've certainly waxed lyrical about on this podcast previously, which is this is as regards US assets. A US attorney might reasonably think you can do what they want with the US assets in an estate plan, but we would say, also let's not forget, don't inadvertently put UK assets inside the estate plan. That still remains good planning. Please don't deal with your UK assets in the US estate plan without having taken UK advice first. But the reason I mentioned that is to go back to one of the points you made previously, which is pensions. Because that client that's left the UK behind and thinking, well, I've only really got a bank account in the UK. It's got 20 grand in it. My pension, obviously UK pensions are outside the scope of inheritance tax. You're going to burst their bubble, aren't you, Emily?
Yes, quite. And sizable pensions that will be triggering inheritance tax most likely, and without the benefit of other allowances, which sometimes apply, like residence no rate bound, etc., because we're talking about pension pots.
Yeah. I remember the conversation I had with Rich Taylor at Plan First Wealth, who does estate planning, does financial planning for Brits in America. That's the name of this podcast. People like him, people who are doing financial planning in the US, need to think really carefully about all of these clients who might have residual pension balances in the UK. Do they leave them in the UK? Can you leave them in the UK? If you're sort of now happily installed in California, the hypothetical client you mentioned previously, can they take those pension assets out of the UK and reinvest them tax efficiently in the US? I'm going to sidestep the answer to that question, but it's a thing that needs to be thought about.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't sound like the most straightforward type of advice and work to do either.
This is why we work in a network of connections. We don't work ourselves. So let's say this person has thought about leaving the UK. We're skipping forward. They have now been outside the UK for some time. To reiterate the point that we had talked about previously, the good news under the new rules is if you decide you want to come back to the UK, whether you are originally from the UK, whether you are a formerly domiciled resident born in the UK, etc., that Brit who's now in America, their position as to whether to come back and the consequences of coming back, those are now perhaps a lot clearer than they were before.
Yes, exactly, because 10 years of non-UK tax residents will reset their clock for inheritance tax purposes and for income and capital gains as well.
I guess the difference for these people now is because they're they're given this new tax free new period. And yes, in theory, they'll be able to take advantage of that 4-year income and gain period, think period that we like to talk about so much. The consequence is going to be watch your residency status for the UK tax purposes quite carefully. You've got a UK home and you come and spend, some months here, you spend 3 months here, 4 months here. If under the old rules, under the current rules as they are, you inadvertently trigger tax residency status for 1 year, I mean, that's a pain. And maybe you've got to file a tax return, but you get out again, it's probably fine. Now, inadvertently triggering 1 year, you might have just lost 25% of your 4-year tax-free period, which can be really quite consequential.
Yes, and you don't get another chance for potentially 3 to 10 years, depending on how many years you were accidentally resident.
It brings more sharply in focus than ever, the sort of needs to think carefully about tax residency status, because you don't want to lose some of these rules if you've got to stay outside the UK for 10 of the last 20 years before you get your new 4-year period. You don't want to be jeopardizing that. And so I would always say take that advice carefully.
Absolutely.
So the last people that we want to just sort of touch on really quickly are people in the UK who maybe benefit from US structures. They're not the people who created these structures themselves. Maybe their parents are in the US and their children are in the UK, either beneficiaries of trusts or maybe potential beneficiaries of the future of estate planning, maybe out of a living trust. We've seen those once or twice or 1,000 times. And the thing we wanted to touch on is what, if anything, is the impact of the budget on those individuals. And here we can be really relatively concise, can't we?
Yes, because ultimately long-term residents of the UK have lost their ability to plan ahead and shelter, their assets from UK tax indefinitely. And so they will be relying a lot more on their, non-UK families potentially to set up efficient structures from which they can benefit. So inherited wealth is
It's now king.
Exactly.
But for the avoidance of doubt, the simple fact of being that beneficiary is not going to be affected by any of these rules. It remained, the case, and there are tax consequences of being a beneficiary. Those rules remain the same. In effect, what we've got is, to your point, other methods of tax efficient planning have receded and are kind of like the tide sort of going back out. The remaining oases left are the only places left sort of to play in, of which inherited wealth is one of them. So
be really nice to your parents.
Be really nice to your parents if you want to avoid inheritance tax at your later death. Emily, thank you so much for joining me over these 3 episodes. It's been a bit of a whirlwind passing all of this, thinking about all of it, and I have no doubt there's going to be yet more that's going to come out that we've not even thought about yet. If people want to get in contact with Emily, they can do. If they want to get in contact with me, please feel free. You will find both of our details at Colin Bristow's website. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us for this 3-part series. Join us again for our regular episodes in due course.